So in this debate, the first thing I'll be doing is characterizing the Iran deal, and then I'll be characterizing Iran and the rest of the world's perspective, and then I would further move on to my argumentation and what Biden should be doing. So first off, the Iran deal. In that era, Obama was really lenient with Iran because Iran had the upper hand because of their nuclear weapons. So now, basically, what is the Iran deal? The Iran deal is basically Iran has to slow down their uranium production, has to slow down their nuclear, and America has to provide military aid to Iran as well because their weapons are being taken away from them. So now I'd like to characterize current day Iran, status quo Iran. So now, because after Trump withdrew from the Iran deal, Iran went back to nuclear. Now what's happening in our current society is Iran is using this nuclear to blackmail Biden to rush back the old deal, to give them back the old deal so they wouldn't have to have the pressure again. So now Iran are currently a nation that's coming back up. They are rich and have power. So if we are to go back to the old deal, we are essentially giving Iran a higher position of power. So this will basically give Iran like leverage against us to negotiate a better deal in the future. So now what Biden should implement and why he shouldn't rush this deal. So as I said before, Iran wants back the old deal because it gives them a higher position of power. So obviously Biden shouldn't be rushing, making drastic decisions, drastic changes that goes against the interests of America. Because remember, Biden as the president of America should cater towards the American people and benefit its people. So as I said, obviously Iran having nuclear is detrimental to America in of itself. So why putting Iran in the position of power is detrimental to America is obviously something that I do not need to further explain. So now, what Biden should do is use the leverage that's gained from Trump's pressure on Iran, to negotiate a better deal. And so, which is why, like I said, Biden shouldn't rush because they currently have that upper hand because of Trump's pressuring. So now, what would this new deal look like? So the first thing we'll do to de-escalate military tension is to, number one, pull out of our military aid. Okay, so this helps both parties because, number one, Iran, the military tension that's currently there with American troops there and Iranian troops already there, this de-escalates the military tension over there. And number two, it saves America money on its already access global policing on the world with its very strong army. So now, and the second thing that Biden should push for is a complete stop of nuclear, not even slow down their uranium production and whatnot. Complete stop of nuclear, complete stop of uranium. So now, why is this important or essentially benefiting America? So now, number one, this is because, like as I said before, this de-escalate the military tension. Obviously, having military tension present is in of itself a threat to America or a nuisance to America, to put it nicely. So now, the second thing on why Biden should have a new deal, why Biden should have a deal but not the old one. So if Biden doesn't go with a deal, then Iran would go restocking again. Basically, what happens is they will continue funding their nuclear warheads, nuclear weapons, uranium production boosted, and this obviously affects America in whole and in general, and this is very detrimental to America, as I've already stated before. So now the third benefit of this, that it's only mutually exclusive to us, is that it saves money on this military spending that has already been a big part of American budget, American economy. So now, what can we? So now, further moving forward into the rest of the world's perspective. So now, moving So now, what does the rest of the world care about? They obviously want the deal, and they feel that America has betrayed its trust. So a deal is obviously going to be necessary for the rest of the world's perspective on America to change, the rest of the world's perspective on America to remain positive. So now, what is their main concern with Iran, and why only America can do it? Is because they have nukes. Iran has nukes, and and America, who is another global superpower, who also has nukes in of itself, is able to negotiate the deal because obviously it's because of mutually assured destruction. So obviously a deal has to be in place. So now the deal. So now with that out of the way, and if the New Deal is implemented, obviously the rest of the world would still be positive on America, because number one, all they care about is the nuclear weapon that is a threat to not just America but the world in general. So now, since after already proving to you why the rest of the world would just care about the nukes, and how they will just be happy with us taking away their nuclear weapons, because as I said, the rest of the world, they don't really care about breaking promises, keeping promises, because this is not primary school. This is global politics, and global politics is all playing for the benefit of your own nation. And so the benefit of the rest of the world with this Iran deal is that there will be no more global threat from Iran from which can be used against the world. And now with the remaining time I have, I would like to summarize what I've said. So I've already proven to you why the Iran deal, Obama was being lenient, and why this is really bad, and why the current deal is very detrimental to the America. And I've also characterized to you why Iran is at a position of power if we return back the old deal. I've also shown you what Biden should do and what the better deal looks like, and I've proven to you why this better deal is better than the old deal. And I've also shown to you why the rest of the world will be happy with this deal as well. And I've never been more proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank the Prime Minister for the speech. Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 4 seconds. I'd like to now invite the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition bench.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, give me a moment to set up my timer. Thank you. All right, before I start my speech, how I would like my POIs to be asked is if you could maybe on your camera and like hold up a piece of paper that says POI, or maybe you could unmute yourself and say POI, because I won't be checking the chat very often. Thank you. All right, so I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, understand that whatever government is telling you is they're telling you that, oh, when we re-implement this Iran deal, obviously Iran's gonna get a leverage from this, right? We tell you that it's not true, but on our side, we tell you that the debate, it shouldn't be mainly focused on whether Iran gets leverage or not, but the debate should be focused on whether this benefits both US and Iran in of itself, right? So this is how my speech is gonna go. First, I'm gonna give my rebuttals towards the Prime Minister. Then I will go into some clarifications, and then I'll go into my first argument. So first thing coming out from government side is to tell you how, like, if the deal is re-implemented, obviously Iran will have a leverage because US doesn't want Iran to continue continue with their uranium supply, right? We tell you that we tell you that the point of the deal of the US and Iran deal is that Iran wants the sanctions, the economic sanctions, to be lifted, and in return they won't be creating more nuclear weapons, right? Where they won't be creating more uranium. There won't be as much uranium supply, right? We tell you that that's the point of the deal, right? It's because Iran, we tell you that Iran is like for now, Iran is diplomatically and commercially isolated from the West. That's why we tell you this is the reason why Iran wants the deal, because they want the sanctions to be lifted. They want to create more ties with the West, right, and more relations with the West to get economic prosperity. Right? This is what the deal is actually all about. And in return, obviously, they're going to cut down with their nuclear weapon supply. They're going to cut down on their uranium supply. And we tell you that this is a win-win situation for both US and Iran, right? I'll be explaining further in my speech. Second, they tell you how Iran won't be threatening them in their world, but we tell you that in their world, it's more likely that Iran is going to threaten the US, right? Because if in their world, they don't want to re-implement the Iran deal, they don't want to implement this deal again, obviously there's going to be more pressure on the US from Iran, where they tell you, we want the deal back, but if you don't give us the deal, obviously we're gonna create more uranium supply, right? That's why we tell you that the threatening happening in their world is far more bigger than in our, right? Where we tell you that we want to re-implement this Iran deal, which is what Iran wants, right? So a few clarifications coming up from our side. First, our stance. First, we believe that by
On that point.
No, thank you. We tell you that like by re-implementing this Iran deal, we tell you that this is reducing the tension between US and Iran, right? And I'll be characterizing later. So my point here in my speech is to prove why this will actually be a net benefit for Iran in of itself. Our stakeholders are obviously Iran and US, right? So a few characterizations. First thing, what is the relationship between Iran and the US like? First, I tell you that Iran is now like in of itself is diplomatically and commercially isolated from the West. This means that they're getting very little economic growth. This tells you that they're getting very economic ties to the West. And we tell you that US is actually one of the biggest economic powerhouse. And we tell you that this is why Iran is willing to agree with the deal, because they obviously want economic prosperity. This is the point of the deal. We tell you that sanctions looks like cutting economic ties with Iran, limiting Iran's development, limiting Iran's economic ties to the West, right? This is what the sanctions looks like. So these are a few characterizations that I have to come up in this debate, because government didn't do a good enough job with that characterization. So my first point coming up from opposition side is, first, Iran is why this is a net benefit to Iran, right? Why? We firstly tell you that Iran obviously wants economic prosperity. And I've already explained in my characterization, because they're diplomatically and commercially isolated. They obviously want to like make more ties and make more relation with countries in the West, right? So we tell you that because US is a big economic powerhouse, we tell you this is one of the most important powerhouse for Iran. Therefore, with this Iran deal not there, this is obviously a loss for Iran, right? And we tell you that this is also a loss for US, but the benefits to the re-implementation for the US will be further explained in my DLO speech. So first, we tell you this is important, because we tell you we obviously want the best for both Iran and US, and we tell you that we want the tensions between the countries in the West, especially US and Iran, to actually we want the tension to be lessened, right? And with this deal not on, this causes two outcomes coming out from government side. First, Iran's economy will not be good. This will definitely continue. They'll continue to be isolated. They'll continue to not have that much economic growth, because of these sanctions that haven't been lifted or should be lifted in order to create these diplomatic and commercial ties with the countries in the West, right? We tell you that this is a net benefit to Iran if we re-implement this deal. Two, we tell you that if this deal isn't re-implemented, this is obviously going to be a harm for like everybody, because Iran's uranium supply will increase, and that is the goal of this debate, right? Is we want to lessen the uranium supply coming out from Iran's side, and obviously in return lessen the sanctions on Iran from the US, right? And that's what everybody wants. And obviously, with the sanctions there, the uranium supply will obviously minimize or like stop their production and stop them from creating these nuclear weapons that are seen as a harm to society in of itself, right? So what is the comparison here between their world and our? We tell you that in our world, when we re-implement this Iran deal, obviously it's going to give a net benefit to Iran in of itself, because we tell you that this is going to create more economic prosperity in Iran, and they won't be like as isolated as they were before from these Western countries, right? When we tell you that these Western countries are a big economic powerhouse to Iran, we tell this is an important thing for Iran's economic growth. And we tell you on their side, when they don't re-implement the deal, obviously it's going to stay as a standstill. They're obviously not going to get as much economic prosperity in their way. They're still going to be like, Iran's still going to be isolated. And this is what happens when and what happens is they will definitely increase their uranium supply, or their uranium supply will continue as normal. And that is the goal of this debate, ladies and gentlemen. This is the goal. We want these supplies to lessen, right? So what have I told you today? First, I've told you that obviously our stance is we want to reduce the tension between US and Iran, and we want to prove that like that there's obviously a benefit both on Iran and US. We tell you the characterizations, we tell you the relationship between Iran and US and how it stands and how US is a big economic powerhouse. We tell you what our sanctions are, and we tell you why this is a net benefit to Iran in of itself. I've never been prouder to propose.
Thank that speaker for that speech. Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 26 seconds. I'd like to now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver their speech.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Good. Give me a few seconds to sort out my notes. POIs can be put in chat and asked verbally. I don't mind both. When someone is desperate and threatening to blackmail or threaten with nuclear weapons, that if no one does anything, they're going to use the nuclear weapons they created, I think it's at that point that you really don't want to give them leverage, because whatever this party is that has so much power, the fact that they're threatening with their power means that they are capable of doing something. And by giving them leverage, it's very likely for you not to only harm the stakeholders that opposition want to protect, that is America and Iran, but also the many other important stakeholders that side opposition fail to talk about. And since they don't want to talk about it, it's more likely they lose, have more harms than benefits. I'll be doing a couple of things in my speech today. First off, providing 3 levels of arguments and the respective levels of analysis, proving what government had to push, operating government had to push, and why we did it, proving what opposition had to push, why they failed to do in all sense and all senses, and that's why they deserve to lose this debate from the get-go. So first part, about the three arguments that I want to bring up today. So why is it that when you rush this deal, why is it something that's harmful let's talk about America first? Because see, understand that how Biden came to power, how Biden won the presidency. Biden won the presidency by being very centrist. He's also a very controversial candidate because there's so much power, so much like backlash from like Trump's previous like reign over like America against him, and anything he does wrong, even like tumbling up the stairs, is getting fired, is getting made fun of, is getting attacked by like the Republican media or like or medias like Fox News, for example. And to the extent, if Biden were to do anything controversial or rushed immediately just after getting into his presidency, is when he's inviting all sorts of attacks from his oppositions, his previous reigns, in order to attack him in like every sense, like why are you rushing? Like these attacks can be things like Fox News saying, why are you rushing the deal? Aren't you supposed to think about a better deal? Why are you going against what our glorious President Trump did before that? All these Trump supporters, all these things that supported previously, will come back and fight against Biden or make it more harder for his presidency in the future. Well, long term, what does this look like? It means that whenever he wants to implement a policy long term in the next years coming for like different issues, he'll have harder opposition against him because of like all the previous things, like all this like distrust, or like these Republicans or not trusting against him because he was rushing the Iran deal. That's one thing. That's why Biden shouldn't do it. And that's why America shouldn't rush into this deal and should take their time in order to think about how they can leverage the power that they have from Trump in order to negotiate a better deal that not only benefits them, but also benefits other people and reduces that power level or the bullying capability of that Iran has currently. Next, we talk about how we can control the Middle East like tension. Understand that the Middle East is something that was never talked about side opposition. And the fact that even the LO claims that the only two important stakeholders are Iran and America, meaning to say that they don't want to talk about the other things. Since it's on an active debate, I just have to prove to you how we bringing more harm to like anyone around you, we can win this debate. So understand that the Middle East is like a bowl of soup because it's all a mess of different like countries all fighting each other, fighting for more control, fighting more control. And Iran is just like that one person who puts so much salt into the soup where it overpowers everything else. The same way, what I mean by this is Iran has been building its nuclear power ever since Trump withdrew from it. Understand that it's not something that it's not nuclear power or nuclear like capability. It's not something that you can gain from the next day. Like today I have like 10 nuclear warships and tomorrow I have like 11 or something like that, which is trying to bring up by like opposition about how Iran can expand their nuclear power. It's not something that we've done like the next week or so, or next day or so. It's something that they've been doing consistently for the past 5 years, ever since Trump, for the past like couple of years, ever since like Trump withdrew from the deal. Because the moment Trump withdrew from the deal and put sanctions, that's when Iran thought, okay, since he withdrew, let's go back to our like military power. Let's build it up more and more and more. So what's the outcome currently? The outcome currently is that one, Iran has like money from all its oil that they've been sending back then during the Iran deal before Trump. Secondly, Iran has so much of nuclear powers and it built up on its nuclear industry so much so that it has the capability to blackmail. So it's not something that is something that's not small nuclear power. It's the fact that they are trying to blackmail other countries, or like America in this case, in order to accept the old deal. So what does it mean if you accept the old deal that was lenient? I understand that we have told you about how the old deal is lenient, but they didn't talk about it, so I assume it still passes. Back then, Obama didn't want to aggress or do something very aggressive that in order to like gain a lot of like backlash against Iran. That's why he proposed a deal where they slow down slow down nuclear warfare and nuclear like production in Iran, slow it down so that, and in return we remove our sanctions. Understand that now the fact that Iran has already been so strong and built up its nuclear power to the point where it's powerful and can threaten like the Middle East, the tension in the Middle East around them, means to say that if you go back to the old deal where it's lenient, all the powers that they currently have, Iran can still use it, and you can just say, oh, we'll reduce it in the future, we'll start to reduce it. What can Iran do with all its nuclear power in the Middle East? It can do things like it can expand its power, it can control other Middle Eastern like countries which are all in turmoil in its own around the surrounding area. They can do it by using the nuclear weapons that they have in order to like gain more power, gain more leverage among this Middle East people. So understand that when you give Iran one, leverage, two, power, three, a lenient Iran deal that will allow them to like use up all these things that they have, is when Iran will more likely not use up its power because they have incentive in order to expand their power and like gain like control like the Middle Eastern area countries around them, and that will mean that they are more likely going to cause like more tensions in the Middle East that can maybe lead to war and more people dying in the future. That's the second argument. Third is, who are the important stakeholders? Understand that we believe that it's not only America and Iran is supposed to be. One, America is an important stakeholder because it's the most it's one of the most powerful superpowers. But what's unique about America compared to the other global superpowers that you can say leverage? Because maybe some of them might come and say that the alternative is use other global superpowers to pressure Iran. Understand that America has a unique position in that it has so much leverage over Iran because of Trump being Trump, rolling back all its sanctions and trying to like put so much insane amount of pressure on Iran because he was being Trump. And to the extent, because America has this unique stance that it has so much of leverage over Iran, it's principally justified for you as America in order to use that leverage in order to negotiate a better deal, negotiate a stricter deal, because situations now have changed than they were before. Iran has nuclear weapons, has so much more nuclear weapons than it had before, and had developed them more so. That's why you should use the leverage that you have. It's principally justified to do so. My third argument about how they should use this power, and I'm going to like, which was the alternative provided by like my PM, that is to completely stop and remove all forms of nuclear warfare, because you don't want any form of nuclear warfare, any form of single superior power in the Middle East, because that can cause a lot of power imbalances, a lot of like proxy wars, a lot of things where people in the end up dying. So what is Shanghai government proven to you today? We've proven to you that brushing the thing is bad. We've proven to you that an old deal is lenient. We've proven to you that nuclear powers shouldn't be given to Iran, and we've proven to you that we are able to reduce tensions not only in America and Iran, but we can reduce tensions in the Middle East and itself. What has side opposition failed to prove to you? They failed to prove to you that it was time sensitive. They failed to prove to you that leverage was important. And since they talk about only America and Iran, they failed to prove to you how they bring more harms than benefits. And that's why side opposition from the get-go should lose debate. And no matter what they can say afterwards, it doesn't change anything. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 26 seconds. I'd like to now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Can you try again?
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, better now. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I would prefer POIs in the form of verbally unmuting yourself, or you can like turn on your camera and show a piece of paper. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This nuclear deal is time sensitive because day by day, ironically, the illustration and the elaboration from Deputy Prime Minister when they talked about how Iran is building its nuclear weapon, making it stronger day by day, and that's why it's an urgent situation that we need to tend to, is exactly the reason why we need to implement this deal as soon as we can, right? But that doesn't mean that we're rushing to we're making impulsive decisions, because regardless of whether, like, even if it is a time sensitive deal, I think it is reasonable to assume that the president, Biden, will still be consulting other world leaders, right? Will still be consulting his cabinet, or will still be consulting other individuals that have this expertise in this certain region. So this is why we think that opening government's case about this deal being an impulsive decision and therefore rushing it is a net harm. First of all, it isn't actually talking about the debate, right? Because they're not actually talking about the harms of the nuclear deal. They're talking about the ways in which we go about this deal, right? Which doesn't actually engage with all the substantives my leader of opposition has mentioned. When we talk about how it increases tension, like Iran is likely to retaliate in a worse manner. All of these harms are things that they weren't willing to engage on. But before I move on to my argument on how it is strategic for the US to agree to this nuclear deal, let's look at a few points coming out from DPM, right? First, they talked about leverage in terms of in terms of economics and in terms of nuclear. Sure, we say that maybe Iran has a nuclear leverage on the US government, but we don't think in terms of economy that the US is any less powerful, or the US has any less leverage on economic, right? Why do we say so? First, we think that the main export of Iran, which is oil, and the indication of the oil market going down, especially because of the pandemic, means that Iran currently is at an economic low. This is the best chance for the US to step in and intervene and have a deal with Iran, because US has a variety of sources of economy, right? Whereas Iran has a sole, or majority of Iran's income coming from oil is severely detrimented by the pandemic, right? So we think this means that even if they have a leverage in terms of nuclear power and nuclear weapons, we think that Iran still has an incentive to want to at least negotiate to attain economic prosperity, or at least not be isolated from the West, from the US and other blocs, right? Especially since they are entering this period of modernization where they want to improve their economic status, which is an inherent incentive of any country, right? But what does this mean, right? This means that Iran is likely to agree and keep their agreement. And in the worst case where they break their agreement, we can just go back to placing sanctions on them, which is again proven by my leader of opposition, a high leverage on these individuals, right? Next, they want to talk about the Biden presidency and how this will bring more controversy onto the current president of the United States, right? I'll deal with this. This will be integrated into my argument. But the conclusion of my rebuttals is that, first, just because Iran has a just because Iran has a growing the fact that Iran is having a nuclear power supply that's growing by the day means that we need to attend to this time-sensitive issue. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to make impulsive decisions. That just means we need to act fast, and we need to implement this deal as soon as we can, right? Second, the fact that they are at an economic low in this point of time means that they're likely to agree and be scared of the sanctions that you place on them. Next, moving on to my argument on how it's strategic for the US on a nuclear deal. I think it's important to understand this can be seen from three aspects. First, like just intuitively, having another nation that you're an ally with means that you're able to have more economic trade with that nation, which is also which is an inherent good. But second, in terms of like the name and the name of the US in the international community, right? We think the US prides itself on intervention and has a incentive to want to look like this nation that is a diplomatic nation, that is a nation that stands for peace resolution, right? Especially given the characterization of government, when they told you that Biden was an extremely controversial candidate, we think this is in the best interest of him to want to prevent more tension in the international community, which could lead to detrimental harms like wars, like even just conflicts, right? We think all of these things that heighten or like increase tension between not only citizens in Iran, but also citizens in the US, because they fear that a war might happen any day, anytime soon. We think this is also a net benefit for Biden's presidency, right? But lastly, and the most important, is in terms of military strategy. No, thank you. We think that it's important for the US to have Iran as an ally, right? Because they can also have military bases in Iran that constantly monitor their neighboring countries like Iraq, like and other like neighboring countries in the Middle East, right? So that is why we think that, like, in terms of just military base, it is also extremely strategic for the US to have a like military base in the proximity of the Middle East, in which they like deploy troops, they deploy armies. We think it's strategic for the US. But second, elaborating on my on my leader of opposition's point about the war, right? We think it is undeniable that President Trump, like the former president's way about this situation, increases the tension between these two countries that were already very tense. What does this mean? This means that Iran is likely to retaliate in a more aggressive manner, right? Especially when they have nuclear power on their side. We think at the end of the day, if in 2015, Obama could get Iran to dismantle key pieces of its nuclear program, we think we can do it also in this point of time when Iran is at an economic low, when US has its best chance to reach a negotiation. Proud to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 14 seconds. I'd like to now invite the member of the government to open the closing half.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Let me set up my timer. Okay, great. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll begin to start my speech with drawing a line between OG and CG and prove to you and tell you what are the differences that we are going to bring today. So note that this is not an active debate. We differ from OG because we will talk about why counterfactual is better and the actual harms of what reinstating the deal looks like. And we will prove to you why it not only harms Iran and the US, but as well as other Middle Eastern nations, as well as the EU. Our burden today is simple, just to prove to you why it brings more harm than good, and to prove why the short-term harms are just more urgent. So the stakeholders that we mainly that will be affected in opposition's role is that how it harms US domestically and harms allied nations that have to deal with the impacts of Middle Eastern conflicts. Secondly, the people in the Middle East that have to suffer. OO does not cover it, and we'll tell you why they will be harmed and defending our burden. So the threat, firstly, to talk about why the threat of nuclear weapon is not as urgent, right? This is an response towards all. So firstly, saying that nukes just works as a form of deterrence. Why? Because it takes a lot of resources, and other countries going to retaliate anyways, right? And why is it unlikely that Iran is going to use it in reality? Is because it escalates violence, and how it's going to start a war just between the EU, the Russia, China, and US, right? And how launching nukes is just bad for Iran itself, because the people will die and violence in the country will just happen, right? And even if it were to happen, it is also in the distant future, and I'll tell you why are there many short-term harm if you lift sanctions. So firstly, why is the counterfactual better? We tell that in our best case, we'll get a new deal, and at worst, we'll just continue the sanction, right? So firstly, why are sanctions better to limit Iran's power? Sanctions make it so Iran cannot trade and expand their powers, and especially when Iran's main income comes from exporting oil. And when they lift sanctions, meaning that they will get the capital to continue building weapons, and they use these weapons as a threat and leverage. And on our side, these sanctions can stop this. Why? Because when you allow funds to because when you let them have the leverage to have funds, means that these funds will be directly going to a authoritarian government, meaning that these sanctions by having sanctions, it's less likely for them to fund militant groups, and Iran has less capital and plummeting economy, right? So why is it bad? Because firstly, domestic instability. People in the US are just against it, right? Because people in the US is just against it. Why? Because by lifting sanctions, it's meaning that you're just directly funding an authoritarian government, right? And this is also our extension, which is very, very important. So domestically, people will be polarized and causes instability over this. And second, people in the US just do not like Middle Eastern militarization. And how it causes instability in the US is bad because it becomes harder to regulate, and there's high risk of backlash like riots and etc. Military-wise, Iran and Saudi have conflicts, right? Saudi is US's ally, which means that US relies on Saudi for oil import. And by allowing Iran to engage with Saudi in proxy wars, it's just against US. And how it affects the EU, right? Because EU takes in a lot of refugees from Middle East because they are just close their geography is just close, right? And when there are more conflicts, this is guaranteed that there will be more refugees, and it negatively impacts on the EU because people just a lot of refugees will just go into the EU, right? And Iran. Why do people in Iran don't want to make a deal with the US, even if it means that sanctions are lifting, because they are still being put under a nuclear tap? They just disagree with negotiations with the US and don't want to be controlled. Even if reinstated, it means that the people of Iran will be against it and cause domestic instability, especially bad when they are already in a state of instability where proxy wars are already happening. Secondly, why support a government that violates human rights, and why is it just principally wrong, right? Because you're taking away the people's rights in Iran, right? And Iran supports terrorist groups so it's just fundamentally wrong. Violence. Increased stability and militarization of the Middle East means that conflict will happen, and more conflict will happen when you put more fund into it, right? And the same concept as people not negotiating with terrorists, US should not even try negotiating because they will not accept the deal in the worst case, and it's also easier to put sanctions, right? Secondly, why allowing Iran to weaponize non-nuclear weaponry is just allowing them to fund the proxy wars with Saudi and escalate the violence in Middle East. Why it's likely to happen? Because they have been proxy wars are used to challenge the Saudi and Israel hegemony, meaning that they want to expand their power in the Middle East, right? Why is it so impactful? And the importance of it is because conflicts cause death and instability between stations. Secondly, the harms are happening right now, and it will be amplified when you lift sanctions. But there are immediate harms that are worse than the empty threat of nuclearization that may, in the best case, may happen in the very far future, right? And harms are international because Turkey being close proximity to EU means that the refugees will bridge across there and flee to the EU and causes a lot of money of EU to accommodate them. Refugee crisis is just bad for other nations because it's expensive to deal with. And also how tensions cause death and war between nations in the Middle East. So thirdly, how JCPOA is to, the whole point of JCPOA is to denuclearize, right? And we'll prove to you why there's not much of a threat, even not much of a threat of nuclear bombs. And we say the comparison is that today, wants to prevent something that's not important and will not likely to happen in the short term, right? But we tell that today, we are going to bring to you like the worst case and the best case. So the best case is that Iran would take the deal, like come back for negotiation because because they are poor and desperate, right? But we tell that it's not right now because when you, and thirdly, saying that how the immediate harms are worse off because you just cause a lot more death and it's going to likely to happen, and it's the more urgent matter in today's debate. Yeah, and better in my speech.
Thank you, Member of Government. The speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 22 seconds. I'd like to now invite the Member of Opposition.
Okay, give me a minute. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, as member of opposition today, I'm going to prove to you why the re-implementation of the Iran deal is going to bring more good than harm, and how government's entire case today is that we're going to disprove government's entire case today and tell you why this is especially beneficial and good for Iran, for the stakeholders today. But before I continue, a couple of rebuttals to engage with side of government, right? My first rebuttal is how, my first point of refutation is how government told us how this will benefit America, right? We would argue that this is simply not true, that that reality more often than not is that this is going to exacerbate diplomatic tensions, which will be integrated into my arguments later, and how and they also told how there will be military tension on our side, right? We would argue that the harms of military tension is like not exclusive on your side. Meaning that if there is no implementation of the Iran deal, Iran will continue to build nuclear arsenal, and this will become like not only a huge threat to its nation, but like America as a whole too. And they also told us how Biden should not rush due to him being newly elected in the presidency. We think this is exactly why he should implement the Iran deal. Reason being is because we think that immediate causes require immediate changes. We think that if they postpone it any further, especially with the tensions and issues growing in the Middle East and Iran, that this will only be counterproductive to their country. Again, they also told us how like how the Middle East how like we don't cater to the Middle East. We would refute that because you know Saudi Arabia, like that country in the Middle East, can interfere with the issue as they are US allies, and like Saudi and US trades oil and protection. We think as long as Iran doesn't break the deal, there's not much card that Iran can use. Yeah. So moving on to my argument today. I have like, okay, what are we going to prove today on side closing opposition? We're going to prove how that Iran's economy will further improve with the Iran deal. Secondly, how sacrificing the nuclear with the Iran deal will be better for the country. And thirdly, how this will better the diplomatic relation between US and Iran. On to my first argument, how we would tell you that this will better the economy for Iran. We have to acknowledge, you have to understand that Iran is a developing country. It's a developing country even in like also financially, right? We think this deal will further improve the economy which in turn means they require less help from other countries and like prosper independently, which I'm going to explain more later. Okay, what is like the problem about nuclear weapons in the first place, right? We think that these weapons can be used for war, and that nuclear weapon is extremely dangerous, especially when researched by countries that don't have much like expertise, don't have like especially countries that are unstable, and we're talking, especially like countries like Iran and so on and so forth. These nuclear weapons is just going to harm the country and the citizens, but like Iran would continue to produce them anyway, right? Because it gives them profits. Why is nuclear weapons extremely harmful? Because given the circumstances, due to the issues in the Middle East, like in Iran, including war and terrorist groups, we think that the existence of these nuclear weapons, that without the Iran to implement it, is going to harm everyone. Okay, so moving on, why do we think that the Iran deal is good? Because we think it's going to create economic prosperity and the sanctions are going to benefit the country. How exactly is this going to benefit the US, right? Like, and also like the diplomatic tension that side of government tells you is not going to happen under our side of the house. We think that the benefits to the US is that by implementing the Iran deal, it will make them like a superpower again, which means that they will prove that they can resolve, because the reason being why they will become a superpower, because it proves that they can resolve tension from like nuclear arsenal, nuclear weapons, and hence be branded once again as peacekeeper of the world, since like Trump has already crushed that perspective from withdrawing out of the Iran deal. We also think that it also ensures the safety, like better the diplomatic tension, and it shows the safety of the US, because with the existence of the Iran deal, there won't be much nuclear threat from Iran to the country itself. How is this going to benefit the entire world? We think that diplomatic relations between Iran and US, the diplomatic relations, because of the absence of the deal, is going to affect the world's economy, because not understand that not implementing the deal will only increase tension, and with that, Iran will keep on stockpiling weapons, stockpiling threats. And since US is an economic powerhouse, international trade will also be disturbed. US will gain pressure from like NATO, Saudi Arabia, its allies, and so on and so forth. What Biden's ideology is, which we support, is how he wants to empower the US superpower as a democratic country. So hence why we think that re-implementation has more benefits, why like everyone will be safer, and US will also become a superpower, which will increase diplomatic tensions and how Iran has economic prosperity. So as a whole, what have I proved to you today on closing opposition? We have proved to you that the re-implementation is the best way to achieve getting stability in the region. Because what will happen without the deal, what will happen under their world, on the side of government world, is that Iran will lift these, because with the absence of the deal, Iran will lift these restrictions on uranium enrichment and its amount of stockpiled uranium, and also like research and development. And and other than that, what this means is that Iran will absolutely resume its nuclear activities, which is just going to harm not only the country but like probably the entire world too. And how on side of government, this will only cause the increase of the buildup of nuclear capability. It is just going to be unstable and detrimental to to the international, like the countries. With that, I've never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you, Member of Opposition. Speaker spoke for 6 minutes and 58 seconds. I'd like to now invite the government whip to close the government bench.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, just give me a few seconds to organize my notes. Thank you.
No worries.
Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. Throughout this whole debate, there are two clashes that I think are prevalent. So firstly, it's about whether we should focus on benefiting Iran or benefiting the other nations, and secondly, the harms of nuclearization and versus the harms of militarization. So firstly, let's talk about the harms of who are we going to prioritize. This mainly happened in the opening house when the opening opposition says that they say that Iran is going to benefit this and the US is going to benefit this. But firstly, let's take a look at what they said, right? So they said for Iran benefiting is because they'll get money, they'll have nuclear development and whatever. Then they also say that the US will benefit because they are going to they want to build ties with Iran. But there are many issues with this. So firstly, let's talk about the problem with this, right? They do not acknowledge the fact that Iran has been known to militarize the Middle East and has engaged in proxy wars with nations in the Middle East, such as the Saudi Arabia. So given that they are engaged in proxy wars, we don't see how this is going to benefit the other nations that are going to be in the Middle East, and especially the US, because they are getting harmed when Iran uses their power to fight against nations in the Middle East that the US is allied with. So from this sentence, we can really concede that the JCPOA does not benefit Iran and does not benefit US. It harms both of them. And Iran just gets a marginal benefit, but you also harm the other nations. So the net harms are more than the benefits that you even get. Therefore, we think that this shouldn't even be a debate, and we think that we shouldn't benefit Iran, especially since Iran has proven to us that they are a very bad country that does not deserve protection and does not deserve to get funding. So moving on, in conclusion, we win out this clash, right? And it's something that is exclusive to closing government because we are the only ones that actually talk about this. So next, let's talk about the harms of nuclearization versus militarization. So we don't think that opening government does enough to tell you why nuclearization is something that isn't as urgent and isn't something that's going to happen, because firstly, let's establish that Iran does not have an incentive they can have nuclear weapons. They say they want to blackmail people. But the thing is, this harm isn't something that we should care about, and this isn't something, the fact that there's mutually assured destruction that's going to happen. And the people of Iran don't even want to engage in World War III to begin with. We think there are more than enough deterrents to prevent nuclear warfare. So the net harms that comes from this is something that isn't going to be actualized, because it's just a waste of resources, expensive, and all the other reasons I've given you. So given that, we don't think this is going to be something that we should take into account, and it's just something that is a big harm. So let's compare that to militarization. So from what we've already told you throughout this whole debate, especially in the closing half, we tell you that when Iran gets funding and the sanctions are lifted, that means they are able to fund the militarization and their weaponization of their own military and the militaries outside to engage in proxy war. So why is this bad? So we tell you the impacts are that when you empower Iran and this authoritarian government to oppress people in and out of the country, this is already in and of itself a harm, because the authoritarian government that Iran is a government that violates human rights. They take away the lives of so many people. They cause a refugee crisis. They cause interstate conflicts in the Middle East. These are all the harms that happen that opposition does not engage with, and this is something that we think is exclusive to our side, because especially closing government, when we tell you that these are things that actually happen that OG does not explain. We tell you that people are going to be displaced, there's a huge refugee crisis. This refugee crisis and the violations of human rights are something that's bad, and this not only affects the Middle Eastern nations, right? Because something exclusively extended on our side is we talk about how it affects people outside of US and Iran, such as the EU. We talk about how there will be the refugee crisis is something that the EU does not want and the people does not want, and therefore causes instability in those other nations. So the militarization of Iran is something that's so impactful because it causes so many third-party harm on the other nations that are involved in the JCPOA. Another aspect of this on why it's bad is, firstly, when US is the main source of the funding because they impose the sanctions, we think that this is going to contribute to the instability of the US as well, and therefore a harm, because the US is a democratic government. They do not want to support an authoritarian government. This goes against the ideology. That means this goes against what the people want, and this is going to cause instability in their own nation, which is a harm. This also, the fact that they are also going to basically pit their ally against another ally, we don't think this is going to benefit the US at all. Therefore, we cannot see any benefit from this. So there's going to be harms from all the impacts that we've given, and this is why we think CG takes the win in this clash. and we properly prove to you all of the net harms that are going to happen. So let's talk about, now we have proven to you why we win both of these clashes. Let's talk about like the small things that opening opposition doesn't do. So they talk about how Iran will retaliate if we on our side with sanctions. But firstly, we are willing to trade this off, and it's already mitigated, and it's not that much of harm because as they've already admitted, Iran is poor. They do not have the capital to retaliate. So we don't see how there's going to be harm. We don't see why we need to prioritize that in this debate. Secondly, they also talk about how they are going to bring sanctions back if Iran is a bad country. We've already proved to you how Iran is bad. We tell you that the likelihood that these sanctions are going to have to be imposed back is so high because of the fact that they're going to militarize other groups and they're going to weaponize them. So this means that that means they do not prove their burden of how there'll be more benefits. Even so, even if their best case for Iran benefits, we don't think that the net benefit is going to outweigh the net harm that's going to come on our side, on their side. So they also talk about the benefiting US, but we've already like sufficiently explained to you how this won't happen because of a bunch of reasons. All their mitigations, such as like building military bases, already exist. We don't see how that is something that's going to benefit them. So for CO, we don't think they have a principal extension. We think that all of the stuff they say is basically a repeat of what opening opposition has already said, and therefore all the problems pertain to them as well. They do not explain how there's going to be a benefit. They never talked about it at all. They ignored how like they talked about how Iran is going to weaponize themselves. We don't see how this is principally different from what opening opposition says, and we have already disproved that to you. So lastly, comparing ourselves to opening government, what we do better. Firstly, they explain a lot about how there's going to be harms, but they never bring us through the process of what these harms look like and the extent of these harms. They only talked about the US, Iran, and maybe a few Middle Eastern nations. Compared to what we say, we tell you this affects the EU, this affects US, this affects Iran, this affects the Middle East nations, and this affects the diplomatic ties between all of these nations. We tell you that these impacts are so bad because of like all of the harms that are going to happen through militarization, and this causes a refugee crisis, and which is a harm towards like the nations that take in these refugees. So therefore, we believe that CG wins out over all of the different houses because we explain to you the importance of all of the harms that are going to happen and the extent of these harms, which is something that opening government doesn't do and something that side opposition refuses to admit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Government Whip. Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 23 seconds. I'd like to now invite the Opposition Whip to end the debate.
First off, let me restate all our points coming from the opposition side, right? First, we have already explained to you how re-implementing this deal would make more ties for Iran, causing them to have more economic growth because having these sanctions lifted up is going to cause them to have more ties, more international ties, increasing their chance, more international ties. And as they wouldn't be as isolated as they are now, and causing them to have more economic growth in their country, and that is what Iran is focusing on. And second, we tell you that why would Iran closing opposition would explain to you why Iran would have the incentive to agree with this motion is that it is going to help increase the economy, which is the main point of this debate. This is a developing country, you see. This is the main point. This is the main focus that Iran is focusing on, and not other stuff. And third, closing government has told us how Biden shouldn't rush their implementation, so that because government told us how Iran has built up their nuclear powers and Gulf shoot nuclear powers, and this is going to increase the threats. We have to realize that how contradicting this is to
to himself, because government should realize that if you're not implementing this motion, this is going to make them incentivize them to make more nuclear powers, because like what the government said just now, he said after Trump has lift the sanctions, Iran made more and more nuclear powers to increase the economy and stuff like that. And not implementing this motion is going to continue. Is going to make Iran to continue on this issue, and then it's going to cause more harm, because having nuclear power is not a good thing itself. And they also stated to us that Iran has engaged in proxy wars and they don't deserve any funds, because Iran has caused so much, like they have caused a refugee crisis and stuff, and they don't deserve any funds. But do they realize that if we don't give them funds right now, they're gonna, if we give them the advantage on this nuclear power, it's going, if we give them the advantage on and give the leverage on having more nuclear power, is going to make them, is going to ultimately cause more harms, because they're going to get more powerful in the Middle East, and then it's going to ultimately cause harm to all the Middle East countries, because they're getting more much more advantage on this nuclear power. And we also told you how. So let me conclude this whole debate. Right. First, we catered to the main stakeholders of this debate, which is the society in the entire world, Iran and US. How it would when it benefit Iran is that lifting these lifting all the sanctions would benefit them economically, benefit Iran economically. That's first. And US is going to better the ties between them, because that's what the US is striving for. They want better relationship with other countries and stuff. And for the main world, obviously we know that for the innocent people, we don't want nuclear warfare to blow up and stuff, blow up people and stuff. And we tell you that they never engaged with any of the points coming from the closing opposition. And closing opposition case benefits all stakeholders, and opening opposition just benefits the UN and US and Iran. We have also proven to you why the case of closing opposition caters to all the stakeholders, and we have also proven to you how the cases risk the safety and financial stability for some stakeholders in today's debate. And with that, we tell you that we have won today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Opposition Whip. Speaker